this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. The war in Asia and the Pacific against Japan is often seen as an American affair. While the US did play a dominant role, the British and Commonwealth forces also made major contributions on land, at sea and in the air, eventually involving over 1 million men and vast armadas of ships and aircraft. Joining me to discuss Britain and the Commonwealth's war in the Far East is Brian Walters, author of Forgotten War, the British Empire and Commonwealth's Epic Struggle Against Imperial Japan. Long-time listeners might recall I discussed the war in the Atlantic with Brian in episode 127, and we looked at the naval campaign in the Mediterranean in episode 173. It's great to have you back, Brian. Let's start with the end of the First World War. Japan had been on the side of the Allies and was a rising power. Did Britain see Japan as a future threat at the end of the First World War?
At this time, I think it's important to understand that Britain comes out of the First World War basically at the pinnacle of its military power. I mean, Britain is arguably the premier military power in the world at this time. The Royal Navy is second to none, clearly outclassing any of its competitors. The Royal Air Force is the largest such service in the world. And even though the British Army isn't the largest army in the world necessarily, but it's come out of the war as arguably the premier fighting force, and it's performed very well in World War I. So they emerged from World War I at the pinnacle of Britain's military power, but the country was also equally exhausted, financially exhausted, psychologically exhausted from the war. And accordingly, they really were sought nothing other than to return to a form of peacetime normality. And over the next few years, the British government is going to embrace the notions of internationalism, the League of Nations, the first arms control agreements, believing that these type of things will be able to be the vessels by which they're going to be able to secure the British Empire's security going forward. And of course, they also adopt the 10-year rule, which basically states there's going to be no major wars for the next 10 years. And what this allows them to do is dramatically slash the defense budgets in all three of the British armed services, which again emerged from World War I at the pinnacle of their power, now are drastically reduced. And they're going forward into this bright new future. But even during this time frame, British officials start to recognize Japan as a potential threat. As early as 1919 to Britain's possessions in the Far East and to the Commonwealth nations of Australia and New Zealand. And as early as 1919, the Admiralty dispatches Admiral John Jellicoe, former commander of the British Grand Fleet, to do a study on what is necessary to defend the Pacific, British interests in the Pacific. And he determines that the British need to permanently station a major fleet there containing no less than 16 battleships and battle cruisers. And he proposes that the cost for doing this be split 75% to the British government, 20% to the Australian government, and then 5% to the New Zealand government. And he makes his proposal, and it's completely rejected because no one is interested in doing this. But a few years later, what the government does do is they authorize the construction of a base in Singapore with the idea that if tensions rise with Japan, we're not going to permanently station a fleet there, but if tensions rise, we'll be able to dispatch a fleet to the Pacific, stationed out of Singapore to confront the Japanese. So yes, as early as 1919, the British recognized Japan as a potential threat.
It hadn't occurred to me, but it's just listening to you there, it just popped into my head that it's not that dissimilar to the American idea. We won't be able to get a fleet there very quick, but if you could just hold out in the Philippines, we'll get all our stuff there. It's a very similar sort of outlook. But this idea of shared defence, I'm not sure that's the word I was looking for. I was more thinking along the lines of the League of Nations and balances of power. So does the Royal Navy expect that the Americans, do they believe that if the Pacific's not necessarily their direct sphere of influence, so they can dial back what's in the Pacific and let the Americans defend it? So they're kind of sharing responsibility?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this isn't anything that's formalized. It's not formalized by treaty, and there's no direct communications that talk about this. But the Americans do have a sizable Pacific fleet that is in the region, And the Americans also have their reasons for wanting to contain Japanese expansion. So the British are kind of fine to sit back and, okay, we're going to let the United States be the primary bulwark to check Japanese aggression from both a practical point of view and also a convenient point of view that, okay, we're going to let the Americans take care of this. Thus, that frees Britain to only have to maintain, minimal forces in the region, more or less just to, maintain trade protection and their national authority over their possessions. So, yes, it's not formalized, but they do have an expectation that the Americans will serve as a bulwark against the Japanese.
If we get to those war years, we have had those austere interwar years. Britain is scrambling to get manpower into the field. How much does that suck away resources before December 41 from the Far East? Does it really leave the Far East denuded of its defences?
Well, that's a very good question, and it obviously has a major impact. The reality is there aren't really that big of defenses in the Far East to begin with anyway. Britain is not really ideally prepared when it enters World War II in 1939. The Royal Navy, even though it's been substantially cut back over the interwar years, it's still the largest Navy in the world. But it's not in quite the dominant position it had been before. The Air Force is actually not as big as the Luftwaffe is at the start of the war, and the Army is in pitiful conditions. So, of course, this is almost 2.5 years before the fighting actually starts in the Pacific, and the British have improved their position to quite a degree. But in doing so, again, the bulk of their forces are going to be sucked into the European war. And as we talked about before, a key tenet of British strategy in the Pacific was, in the case of rising tensions in the Far East, we'll dispatch the Navy to Singapore. Well, now in 1941, the British aren't in a position to be able to do that because the Royal Navy is fully engaged in combating the Germans and the Italians in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. And there is no fleet readily available to send. In fact, all the British can send are token forces. And give you an idea of how that balances out. And when I say British, I'm talking about the entire Commonwealth included into this. On the eve of the Pacific War, the British have 2 capital ships in the Pacific that have just arrived. Those are the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. The Japanese have 10 battleships. The British have no aircraft carriers. The Japanese have 10. The British have 1 heavy cruiser. The Japanese have 18. The British have 7 light cruisers. The Japanese have 18. The British have 13 destroyers. The Japanese have 113. They have no submarines. The Japanese have 63. And there are no naval aircraft to speak of in the Far East, and the Japanese have 1,750. So even though the Royal Navy at this time is substantially larger than the Imperial Japanese Navy, it's clear that when the war starts, they're going to be at a great numerical disadvantage. And the same holds true for the Army and the Royal Air Force. Again, the Army expands from almost nothing to, by this time, it's got over 2 million men under arms, plus another several 100,000 coming from the Commonwealth and the Empire. But virtually all of these are either earmarked to Europe or they're still in their home countries mobilizing. This leaves only about 100,000 men actually available to garrison Britain's positions in the Far East that are most directly threatened by the Japanese. And the same is true with the Royal Air Force, which, of course, at this time is thousands of aircraft strong, including many excellent aircraft types. But they only have 265 aircraft actually stationed in Singapore, of which most of them are second-line models, ranging from the Brewster Buffalo, which is an American-supplied fighter, which is clearly inferior to its comparable Japanese fighters, to the Vickers Wildebeest, which is a biplane torpedo bomber that's absolutely obsolete. And on top of that, most of the pilots that are stationed at Singapore have no combat experience. Some of them are fresh out of pilot training school. And to compare and to contrast this against the Japanese have several hundred aircraft that are available to utilize against Singapore. And their pilots have between 500 and 800 hours of flying time on average on their various aircraft types. And 50% of their Army pilots and 10% of their naval pilots have a practical combat experience fighting in China or against the Russians. Again, the British are going to enter this war at a distinct disadvantage, despite the fact that all 3 of the British services are larger than the Japanese overall, but the bulk of everything is in Europe, and very little is left over to confront the Japanese.
It does make you wonder how much the Britain is sitting back on what it believes its reputation is. When they send the Prince of Wales the Repulse, as a show of force, you put it into perspective, it's not really much of a show of force at all.
Don't think the Japanese were overly impressed by that necessarily. They used what they had available at the time.
So, I mean, everyone's aware of the attack on Pearl Harbor, which most people just think, well, that's the start of the war is Pearl Harbor. Start of the war with Japan is that attack on Pearl Harbor. But are there similar preemptive attacks on the British Empire on the same day that sort of are lost in the Pearl Harbor narrative?
Well, that's true. But the Japanese carry out a series of attacks against a variety of targets all at the same time. They're very well coordinated. As you mentioned, the Pearl Harbor attack is the one that gains the most notoriety. And it's rightfully so, because in one fell swoop, the Japanese cripple the American battle fleet. Now, thankfully, none of the American aircraft carriers, the Americans have 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific at the time, which, again, the Japanese have 10, the Americans have 3. None of those are at Pearl Harbor when it is attacked. So they're spared. But 8 American battleships are put out of action, so some permanently, others temporarily. But the American battle fleet's basically been neutralized, at least temporarily. Other actions that take place during this day, the Japanese will carry out airstrikes against American airfields in the Philippines, catching most of the aircraft on the ground and destroy about 100 aircraft in the first day of the war, basically crippling American air power in the Philippines. The situation is not much better in Malaya, where Japanese air attacks will either destroy or neutralize about 60 of the 110 aircraft the British have in the northern Malayan airfields. The Japanese will attack the international settlement at Shanghai. And in the process of this, there are 2 Allied river gunboats that are stationed there. One of them is the American Wake, and the other one is the British Peterel. The Japanese demand to surrender these vessels. Wake complies. The Peterel is defiant and refuses to surrender, is promptly sunk by overwhelming Japanese firepower. This will be the first British warship loss in the new Asia-Pacific War. The Japanese on this day begin their invasion of Hong Kong, which is garrisoned by about 12,000 British and Imperial personnel. These contingents come from the United Kingdom, India. There's a Canadian contingent, and then also local forces that are there. They're in a hopeless situation. They're deep inside Japanese-controlled territory. Hong Kong is. There's no prospect of reinforcing this garrison or withdrawing it. The garrison will actually do a pretty credible job of defending itself, holding out for 17 days. During the process, it'll inflict an estimated 6,000 casualties on the Japanese forces. But of course, eventually it surrenders on December 25th. And then from a British point of view, the most important thing that happens on this day is the Japanese will begin their invasion against Malaya. There's 2 components to this. The biggest component is the Japanese will land forces in the Kra Isthmus in southern Thailand, which will give them access to northern Malaya. And then the second part is they also do landings at Kota Baru in northeast Malaya and be successful in these landings, which thus begins the invasion and conquest of Malaya.
Considering Fortress Singapore is the linchpin of the British defence of Malaya, presumably that's why the Japanese are putting an aggressive attack in there. Is there much to defend Singapore?
At the time, there is a garrison of about 80,000 men. And as I said before, there's 265 aircraft that are located there. So you actually do have a fairly sizable garrison. But the problem isn't so much necessarily the size of the garrison. Obviously, they only have about a third of the aircraft the British deem necessary. But the problem isn't so much the size of the garrison, it's the quality of the garrison at this time. Again, we talked about some of the conditions that the British Royal Air Force has there. If those had been Spitfires and Bullfighters instead of Brewster Buffaloes and Wildebeestes, that certainly would have made a difference. If the 80,000 man garrison had been of the caliber of the 14th Army, say as it is in 1944, I think there's a good chance the British are able to defend Malaya. But to no fault of their own of the forces that are employed there, they are not really in a condition that they would want to be in order to defend Malaya. One of the things that will happen once the Japanese get established there, the Japanese have about 600 aircraft when they support their invasion. By this time, the British are down to about 100 operational aircraft. The Japanese have 200 tanks. The British have no tanks. The Japanese tanks by European standards are inferior, but British will find that inferior tanks are superior to no tanks. there's just a number of factors that are going to, again, make it very difficult for the garrison to hold Malaya.
In theory, they have Z Force, don't they, to
Force Z?
Force Z, yeah. It is to defend Singapore, which is the Prince of Wales and Repulse, and that doesn't really go very well.
Right. The British dispatch, Force Z, Admiral Phillips, will take Force Z out of Singapore on the night of the 8th of December. Basically, his goal is to go up and attack the Japanese landing forces that are landing in the Kra Isthmus, as we talked about. On the 9th, he realizes that he's lost the element of surprise because they've been spotted by various Japanese reconnaissance aircraft and so on and so forth. And he's also informed that he's unlikely to get any air support because of the situation of the northern airfields. So he decides to abandon his sortie and turn around to return back to Singapore. Unfortunately, of course, on the 10th, he undergoes a major Japanese air attack that's carried out by 51 Japanese torpedo bombers and 34 high-altitude bombers. To give you an idea of the scale of this force, this is 4 times the number of aircraft that the British used to cripple the Italian fleet at Taranto, and it's 5 times more aircraft than the Ark Royal used to cripple the Bismarck. So it's a substantial force, and the British ships have no air cover. And of course, the result is both Prince of Wales and Repulse are sunk, thus depriving Britain of the sole 2 capital ships it does have in the region are now gone. Of course, the American battle line is crippled at Pearl Harbor, and the Pacific is wide open to the Japanese now.
Yeah, and it's incredible. That's it, essentially, for Britain's big defensive plan for holding out. Singapore surrenders. But then we get the attack on Burma, which I always think is interesting because, I mean, it's famous for being the longest withdrawal in British Army history. Had the British ever really considered an attack on Burma? Because if you look at the old Imperial map, it borders Thailand. So one would assume Britain would feel fairly secure holding Burma.
That is an accurate assessment. Before the war, the only forces that were retained in Burma were just enough to maintain internal security, which was also primarily true of the British Indian Army. Its primary role was internal security of India. It wasn't really there to withstand external invasions. And British defense planners, as you indicated, really did not consider the likelihood of an invasion of Burma, primarily because of geography, because as you stated, they considered Thailand as a buffer that would be between them and any potential Japanese assault. Of course, what happens is that the Japanese invade Thailand against the Kra Isthmus. The Thais immediately align themselves with the Japanese and become a puppet state of Japan, and then thereafter declare war on Britain and the United States. Now, the Thais will not really do any actual fighting during the course of the war, but they become like a puppet client of the Japanese. So the buffer that the British had depended upon disappears immediately. And of course, the other buffer they depended upon was Singapore and British naval power to protect their sea flank. Again, that obviously holds out a little longer, but of course, that doesn't hold out that long, and eventually that's eliminated as well. And the other thing to take in consideration, of course, is Burma is not an easy place in any type of situation to conquer because of the topography and the fact that the country is heavily jungle clad, mountainous. It's got all of these rivers that are cutting through it that are going to be against the lines of advance. And yet, when the Japanese do invade, they're able to move very quickly through this jungle environment. The British forces that are there, and again, the British hadn't stationed significant forces there, but they basically rushed 2 divisions to defend Burma. These are 2 Indian divisions. The first is the 1st Burma Division, but don't let the name fool you. It was actually an Indian division. And the second was the 17th Indian Division. Both of these had just formed up within the last year. They weren't really prepared for the task at hand. They weren't fully equipped. They weren't fully trained, and they're rushed into this type of a situation. And the British are very much tied to the limited road network that exists in Burma, and the Japanese are much more adept at just cutting through the jungle. And time and again, the Japanese will be able to use a tactic, which they also used in Malaya quite effectively, of any time they reached any type of resistance, they simply would infiltrate around the flanks, cut the lines of communication, and compel the British to retreat. And this will be a perpetual thing that will go on. And as you said before, it will result in the longest retreat in British military history over a period of a few months. they're forced to give up Burma.
Yeah, in typical British style, though, we have as Dunkirk is almost seen as a success. The longish withdrawal is almost billed as a success as well. Well, we got out, very very British thing to do, defeat our way to victory.
Well, yeah, and the idea is, was this a success? Well, of course, it was a defeat because they lost Burma, and the casualties kind of tell the story here too. The British during the Burma initial Burma invasion will suffer 13,463 casualties. Japanese casualties for taking Burma are 2,431. So it's a fairly substantial defeat, but I guess it is a success, in the light of, unlike Hong Kong and unlike Singapore, where the entire garrisons go into the bag, at least here the British are able to get most of their forces out. Yeah, they suffer 13,000 casualties, but the bulk of their forces are able to withdraw. So it's a defeat, but in that sense, I guess it's less of a defeat than what they had established or what they'd endured at Hong Kong and in Malaya and Singapore.
Considering they're now within months, they're staring into India almost, and the Indian Army is the largest volunteer army at this point in history. I thought that was the case, and I had to double check by looking it up again because it's such an incredible figure. That must have been some comfort for the British when they're considering defending India with the Japanese pushing on. Are the Japanese interested in pushing further?
No. The Japanese, they're advancing to Burma as far as they're intending to go. Of course, that's not necessarily known at the time. The British are concerned about a nightmare scenario because if you're about the same time this is happening is British fortunes in the Mediterranean at their lowest ebb. This is the time when the Battle of Gazala has been fought. And Rommel is advancing into Egypt, and the British are contemplating a nightmare scenario where you got the Japanese advancing from the east, the Germans advancing from the west, and they're going to cut all the way across Asia and conquer the whole region. Now, in retrospect, now we realize that there were no coordinated plans to do that to begin with. But even had they attempted it logistically, that would have been practically impossible. But at the time, they were contemplating, because the Japanese up to this point had seemed to be able to perform the impossible from a British point of view, and they're contemplating this thing. As far as the defense of India, again, at the beginning of the war, the British Indian Army numbered a little over 200,000 men. But again, this was primarily there for internal security, and again, it wasn't there to repulse external threats. They do go through a mobilization effort, as you talk about. Eventually, some 2.5 million Indians will eventually become part of this force. And I will point out at this time too, when we're talking about these Indian units, I'm sure most of your listeners know this, but some may not. When you're talking about a typical Indian division, a substantial portion of those forces are British. Most of the officer corps are British, and a third of the combat forces in a typical Indian division are British as well. So they're actually combined British/Indian formations. So the British Indian Army has plans to mobilize several divisions during 1940 and 1941. As divisions become available, 4 of them have already been sent to the Middle East to wage war against the European Axis. What's left in India at the time, as the Burma campaign is winding down, for the actual defense of India, the British have 7 divisions. One of them is a British division, 70th Division, which has just arrived there from North Africa. And the other 6 are Indian divisions. Of these, all of them have recently formed up. None of them is fully prepared. Again, they're in the process of equipping. They're in the process of organizing. They're in the process of training. 3 of the divisions only have 2 instead of the normal 3 brigades. So they're not ideally ready to engage the Japanese. And then the situation in the air is much the same, where the British determined they need 64 squadrons in order to effectively defend India, and they have 15 squadrons that are available from the RAF, of which one of these squadrons is a squadron in paper only because it has no operational aircraft. 5 of the squadrons are equipped with obsolete aircraft that are basically useless against the Japanese. This leaves 9 squadrons that are effectively available against a requirement of 64, or basically about 1/7 of the requirement. And this small force, plus a handful of fleet air arm aircraft, is what the British have available. But fortunately, the Japanese don't really have any intentions to advance beyond Burma, at least up to this point in the war.
What's interesting there, you talk about units moving to and from India to the Middle East. Now that sea link to India is crucial about when they're moving in men and material. Do the Japanese ever consider interdicting British supply lines across the Indian Ocean? It would seem like a logical thing for them to do to try and weaken those British forces in India.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some examples where the Japanese do some limited attempts. It's not an all-out effort, but there are different times and there are some limited attempts. I mean, the first major thing that's going to occur is in April of 1942, which, of course, the Burma campaign is still going on there. The Japanese will sortie a strong carrier force into the Indian Ocean to attack Ceylon. Now, that's primarily targeting, British, the Royal Navy and the Eastern Fleet, which is located there. But in addition to that, at the same time, a Japanese cruiser and destroyer squadron will proceed into the Bay of Bengal and be very successful. And during this time frame, they'll be able to destroy 23 Allied merchant ships worth about 112,000 tons. At the same time, Japanese submarines are operating on the west of India, and they'll sink another 5 merchant ships worth 32,000 tons. And then from May through October, Japanese submarines will continue to operate in the Indian Ocean. They'll sink another 31 Allied merchant ships worth 144,000 tons. And the Japanese will finally, they'll attempt a limited armed merchant cruiser campaign in the Indian Ocean. They're impressed by what the Germans were able to do with some of their armed merchant cruisers, so they try to do the same thing. They convert 2 Japanese cruise liners, about 10,000-ton vessels, as armed merchant cruisers. This is the Taikoku Maru and the Aikoko Maru, if I'm pronouncing these correctly. They dispatch these into the Indian Ocean. Unfortunately, they meet a Dutch tanker that's escorted by an Indian minesweeper. The 2 Allied vessels are heavily outgunned, but they put up an effective defense. There's basically a 4-inch and a 3-inch gun between the 2 vessels, but they put up a credible defense, and they actually are able to sink the Haikoku Maru, and this results in the Japanese then ceasing all further armed merchant cruiser activity. They've decided that that's not necessarily what they want to pursue. So again, you have these things going on in 1942. Thereafter, the Japanese are really focused on what's going on in the Pacific. There'll be occasional Japanese submarine sorties into the Indian Ocean thereafter in 1943, going into 1944. There'll be one more minor Japanese cruiser sortie into the Indian Ocean. Again, the Japanese will cause some damage, but they're not successful in actually severing these lines of communication.
It's fascinating they don't concentrate on it, but as you point out, there's a lot going on in the Pacific against the US Navy to tie them up.
Yeah, and another big part of this, too, is the Japanese doctrine and how they use their submarines. By and large, they don't use their submarines against merchant shipping. That's not the type of war they're trying to engage in. They primarily believe that their submarines are going to be used against enemy surface warships. And so the Japanese then, are after the war are criticized for this doctrine. Had they been more focused on engaging general mercantile warfare, of course, I'm sure part of this would have spilled into the Indian Ocean, and they probably would have caused far greater damage than what they did.
So at Quebec in May 43, the Allies agree on Southeast Asian Command, SEAC, which I think my great uncle was part of at some point. What does this realistically mean? Is it a game changer? Is this the point for the British and Commonwealth troops on that Burma border? Is this their turning point?
To a degree, it is. I mean, SEAC is activated in November 1943, and as you indicate, it's basically a joint command where all of the different headquarters are put under one joint Allied commander. It's an Allied command. SEAC is primarily made up of British formations, but there's also American elements in it, Chinese elements in it, but it's overwhelmingly British. And its area of responsibility is Burma, Malaya, and Sumatra with the surrounding seas. And then it has some further like clandestine operations and offensive operations into like Thailand and beyond. But its primary area of contest effectively will be Burma. Again, the activation of SEAC in and of itself, yes, it improves the overall command function within the region and ties it all together. But I think what's even more important is the activation of SEAC coincides with the fact that the British now are finally strong in the region. Again, we left Burma. It's about May 1942 when the British complete their withdrawal from Burma and move into India. A year and a half has passed since then. Now, again, the Far East has not been a priority for the British war effort, but still within that year and a half time frame, they've been able to have a constant trickle of forces move into the Far East area of operations, to the extent that when SEAC is activated now, the British are finally strong. The main combat element in SEAC, as far as ground warfare, is the 11th Army Group, which in turn, the main combat element of that is the British 14th Army, which is activated under the command of General William Slim. 14th Army is a very strong formation. Over the next year and a half, it will employ a total of 13 divisions, 2 British divisions, 8 Indian divisions, and 3 West African divisions. And these aren't, again, the type of forces that the British had to use in 1941 and 1942. These are fully trained, fully equipped, well-organized, well-led formations, and they're ready to take on the Japanese. The situation in the air is much the same. The main air element in SEAC is Eastern Air Command, which at the end of 1943 maintains about 800 aircraft. 65% of these are British, 35% are American. And again, now we're talking about, in many cases, top-line Allied aircraft. Instead of Brewster Buffaloes and Victor Villibeasts, you've got Spitfires, you've got Bullfighters, you've got Liberator bombers, and they are actually, again, a much greater position. And then the naval component is the Eastern Fleet, which after, a year and a half of real privations, is finally at the point of starting to be regenerated, because Italy has now left the war. The Italian fleet has surrendered. The Allies have definitely turned the tide in the Atlantic, and the Admiralty is finally free to start sending meaningful resources to the Far East. So this is a turning point in the fact that the British now are ready to take on the Japanese as you move into 1944.
So what's difficult to understand there at that point is the British have got a powerful army. They've been able to take some time to train, re-equip. At the same time, the Americans in the Pacific are aggressively pushing forward. The Japanese have passed their high watermark, yet they choose to attack into India in 1944. What's their thinking? It just somehow doesn't make any sense.
Well, you're absolutely right. By 1944, the Japanese are pretty much on the defensive everywhere. One of the major exceptions to this, of course, as you indicated, it would be in Southeast Asia, in the SEAC area of operation. Now, at the time, at the beginning of 1944, the Japanese have very strong forces in Burma. Some people will tend to kind of overlook that, but the Japanese have over 300,000 men in Burma. The main command of this is what they call the Burma Area Army, and then 3 main subcommands of this are 3 field armies. You have the 15th, the 28th, and the 33rd Field Armies. And between these, each field army is about the equivalent of a British corps, and a total of 9 divisions spread between these. So the Japanese have a formidable force in Burma. Now, their strategic ambitions are to continue to defend Burma. They're not looking to conquer India, but believing that offense is the best form of defense, the 15th Army, one of the field armies, devises a plan to launch a limited invasion into a portion of India, the idea of which is we're going to take a couple strategic areas. The primary target is Imperial, which is the administrative center of the British Fourth Corps. In the Imperial Plain, you have a number of depots and airfields located in it. It's the administrative center. And then the other area they're going to target is Kohima, which doesn't have any importance of itself other than the fact it's astride a major road, which again is logistically important to the British. So the Japanese believe by taking these 2 areas, and in the hope is in the process of doing this, they're going to effectively destroy Fourth Corps in the process of this, that they're going to be able to delay any British incursion into Burma for the foreseeable future. It's a spoiling attack, essentially. And then there's a final component of this is the Japanese hope that once they've got this little sliver of Indian territory under their control, they're going to establish a free Indian government on that territory to try and undermine British control of the subcontinent. So those are the Japanese objectives. It is limited in its scope. again, it's primarily a spoiling attack in order for them to help defend Burma. Of course, it doesn't work out the way they want. They launch their attack. The 15th Army consists of 3 Japanese divisions, the 15th and the 33rd, which will attack and envelop Impal, and then 31st Division that goes to Kohima. General Slim, he's not going to allow his units to be cut off and destroyed piecemeal. He orders the 3 divisions that exist within 4th Corps to withdraw back to the Impal Plain, where they're going to form a strong defense, and then he's going to bring in aerial resupply to keep them supplied. The one area that's a bit tricky at first is the British hadn't anticipated that the Japanese would simultaneously also go after Kohima. They had considered that there might be an assault against Kohima, but they didn't think that the Japanese would go after both Impal and Kohima at the same time. And then they assumed that if they did go after Kohima, it would only be regimental strength. So when the British realized that the Japanese sent an entire division against Kohima, they're not in a good position to defend that, and they rush reinforcements to Kohima, but only one battalion actually arrives. And what you end up with is a scratch garrison that defends Kohima, consisting of about 2,500 men against the Japanese division, and they're cut off. And again, there's an 18-day siege, which is one of the epic sieges of World War II. British hold out. Again, a factor in this, of course, is, again, they're receiving aerial resupply and stellar support from the Eastern Air Command in terms of direct attacks against the attacking Japanese forces. But they're able to hold out, and then eventually, after 18 days, they're relieved. It take about a month for the British to drive the Japanese 31st Division out of Kohima, and then there's fighting as they march down the road, link up with the forces in Impal. In the meantime, the 2 Japanese divisions have basically been battering their heads against this powerful defense that the British have established around the Impal perimeter. And after 4 months of fighting, the 15th Army is finally forced to withdraw, having accepted defeat. In the process of this, the army has been largely decimated. The Japanese will end up suffering, out of the 85,000 men they employ in the offensive, 53,000 casualties, including 30,000 dead. The Indian National Army Division, which supported their operation, which was a rebel Indian force consisting of about 7,000 men, that suffers 4,400 casualties during the Battle of Impal and Kohima. British casualties in return, a number about 16,600. So, costly for the British, but far more costly for the Japanese. And this will actually be the worst defeat that the Imperial Japanese Army has ever suffered in its history up to this point. And of course, then the British will use this as a springboard to launch an offensive and reconquer Burma itself.
We're going to pause there a moment, Brian. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm talking to Brian Walters about the war in the Far East. As the British and Commonwealth forces are on the move in Burma, the US campaigns are obviously full swing in the Pacific. The Royal Navy doesn't often get discussed. How involved were the Royal Navy, certainly with US operations? The Royal Navy is pretty big, and presumably by 44, in many respects, the Battle of the Atlantic's won, presumably more shipping has come online. Are they involved with those American operations?
Well, they will be at the end of the war. I think there's really, when you're looking at the overall British maritime effort against Japan, again, I'm tying in the Commonwealth contribution. There's 4 major contributions here, or 4 major elements to this. Number one is once the Royal Navy is ejected from the Pacific, not that there was ever that great of a Royal Navy presence there to begin with, but once they're objective, it falls upon the Royal Australian Navy and the Royal New Zealand Navy. They have a handful of warships, cruisers and destroyers, plus support vessels that will participate hand in hand with the United States Navy throughout all of this fighting. They don't get a lot of publicity, and a lot of the service they do is kind of behind the scenes, but they perform yeoman service. That's element number one. Element number 2 is the Eastern Fleet, which we talked about briefly, which operates in the Indian Ocean. It starts out as the Eastern Fleet and eventually we convert it to the East Indies Fleet. But this is, again, for the first couple of years, the conflict is relatively weak. Fortunately, it's not challenged by the Japanese. But by 1944, it's building up to a point where now it's taking the offensive against the Japanese, engages in a number of different operations in the Indian Ocean. It participates in the Third Arakan campaign, which, the British are able to successfully clear the Arakan region of Burma. And of course, it's a key participant in the actual capture of Rangoon, which is, seaborne landing. And then another thing that the kind of a success that the Eastern Fleet enjoys is in May 1945, 5 British destroyers from the Eastern Fleet intercept and engage and sink the Japanese heavy cruiser Hagoru off of Penang. And this is the final major surface engagement of World War II. And so it's a nice little success for the Eastern Fleet to kind of close out its operations. A third element is the submarine operations. During the course of the war, about 30 British submarines and a handful of Dutch submarines that operate under British control are waging war against the Japanese. During the course of this time, they'll sink just under 700 Japanese vessels. Most of these are minor craft, but this includes 15 purpose-built warships, including 3 cruisers that are sunk by British submarines, and also includes 46 sizable Japanese merchant ships. The British will lose 3 submarines and the Dutch 4 in this effort. And then the finer element, which I think is what you were kind of alluding to, is the British Pacific Fleet. And that's kind of, what people tend to gravitate towards. British Pacific Fleet comes into being in November 1944. It will eventually have over 250 warships and support vessels supporting it. But at its core, the major combat element revolves around 6 British aircraft carriers that will see service over the next 9 months against the Japanese. Not all at the same time, but altogether, 6 different British aircraft carriers will see service against the Japanese. And these will participate in 3 major operations. The first of these is in January, the British carriers of the British Pacific Fleet will launch airstrikes against the Palembang oil refineries in southern Sumatra. Now, this is an incredibly important strategic target because these oil refineries are capable of satisfying 50% of all of Japan's oil usage and 75% of its aviation usage. Up until this point in the war, these oil refineries have gone largely untouched. In January, the British Pacific Fleet launches 2 airstrikes against the 2 different refineries. This would be Operations Meridian 1 and Operation Meridian 2, during which both are heavily damaged. And the result of this is aviation fuel production from these refineries is reduced by 65% through the remainder of the war. So a major strategic impact that these strikes have. And in the process of this, the British also destroy 121 Japanese aircraft in related combat. Now, once they've arrived in the Pacific, then the next major operation that British Pacific Fleet will participate in is they'll serve alongside the American Fifth Fleet in carrying out the invasion of Okinawa, Operation Iceberg. What they will do is from March through May, for 62 days, the British Pacific Fleet, now the combat portion of this, which is now designated Task Force 57, will conduct a series of airstrikes, 23 days of airstrikes and a shore bombardment against Japanese positions at the Sakashima Gunto, which basically allows the British to protect the southern flank of the American fleet. During these strikes, the British will destroy or damage about 150 Japanese aircraft. They'll destroy or damage about 186 Japanese vessels, again, mostly minor tonnage. But the most important thing that they do is that they're providing this flank protection. During these times, of course, the Japanese will launch kamikaze attacks. All 5 of the British carriers that participate in these strikes will receive kamikaze hits. But because of their stout construction and their armored flight decks, which the American carriers don't have, all will be able to remain on station through their scheduled deployments. During the same time frame, no less than 7 American carriers will be either hit by kamikazes or conventional bombing attacks and be forced to withdraw from the area to undergo repairs. So that is the second contribution that the British Pacific Fleet makes. And then after that, the final operation that they carry out is, again, they will serve alongside the American Third Fleet now. The Task Force 57 has been redesignated Task Force 37 as a result of that, and they'll carry out a series of airstrikes against the Japanese home islands in July and August of 1945. During these strikes, the British will sink about 50,000 tons of Japanese shipping, including 12 purpose-built warships that are sunk either solely or partially as a result of these British airstrikes. They'll damage another 300,000 tons of Japanese shipping, and they'll they'll destroy or damage 347 Japanese aircraft during these strikes. That will be the last operation. The last major operation of Task Force 37 will cease on the 10th of August, and 5 days later, the war ends. But it's kind of a fitting way to end the Royal Navy's engagement against the Japanese, because a few years before, of course, you have the loss of the Prince of Wales or Pulse, and now you have British warships literally operating on the doorstep of Japan, including surface warships that are carrying out bombardments of the Japanese positions. I mean, imagine a Japanese fleet operating off of Liverpool, and I mean that's the degree of the way the whole situation had turned on its head now, and it's a positive way for the Royal Navy to conclude its efforts against the Japanese.
Going back to that point we made at the start, and then sort of trying to link it with the Royal Navy sort of becoming much bigger deployment in the Pacific. How much is the US naval dominance in the Pacific reliant upon the Royal Navy with its Commonwealth partners doing the heavy lifting in the Atlantic, freeing up the US Navy?
Yeah, in my mind, and one of the things I write in my book is the idea that you look at the contribution. Well, first of all, let me back this up. I think it's important to acknowledge that at its core, the main factor in the defeat of Japan was the naval war. Japan, like Britain, is an island. Japan, like Britain, was not resource self-sufficient. Japan went to war in order to establish an Asian empire, in order to acquire resources. And they were initially very successful. But in order to be able to exploit those resources, you need maritime power. The United States, predominantly with some contributions from the British Empire and Commonwealth, decimates Japanese maritime power. I mean, by the end of the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy has been decimated. The Japanese merchant fleet has been decimated. The result is Japan is entirely, the Japanese home islands is entirely cut off from the empire. It's under blockade. It's under aerial bombardment. The Japanese economy is collapsing. Japanese war industry is collapsing. The Japanese people are on the brink of starvation, and there's nothing the Japanese can do to reverse this situation. And this is overwhelmingly brought about by naval power. And America is overwhelmingly the dominant player in this, to the extent that over 90% of all Japanese warship losses and merchant shipping losses are attributable to American action. Now, again, the British do participate. During the war, British and Commonwealth forces will sink or participate in destruction of 42 Japanese principal warships. That's constitute about 5.4% of their total warship losses. British and Commonwealth forces will account for about 4% of Japanese merchant shipping losses. So they're making contributions, but obviously it's small compared to what the Americans are doing. But in my mind, the greatest contribution that the British make to the naval war in the Pacific is, as you said, they're doing the heavy lifting in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean against the Germans and the Italians, which is no minor task, because the Battle of the Atlantic is the most important campaign that the Allies will wage during World War II. And the German Kriegsmarine is a very formidable force. As I pointed out in previous talks, and people find this very surprising, but actually, during the course of the war, the Kriegsmarine will eventually be over twice the size of the Imperial Japanese Navy in terms of total numbers of principal warships, at 1,640 compared to 773 for the Imperial Japanese Navy. 3/4 of these German vessels are U-boats, but this also includes 450 surface warships. And it's primarily the British that defeat the Kriegsmarine. It's primarily the British that defeat the Italian Navy in the Mediterranean. And this frees up the United States in order to devote the majority of its naval power to confront the Japanese and score those successes that I talked about before. So in my mind, the greatest contribution the British make to the naval war in the Pacific is this indirect contribution of doing the heavy lifting in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean.
That's a fantastic way of looking at it. It's really, I love your books, Brian, because you always manage to pull out these statistics in them and facts that somehow I've never considered looking at it like that before. Now, the other one I was going to ask you about was how much does Germany first hinder, if at all, operations in the Far East? Because you have some fascinating things to say about this in the book.
What Germany first was is in December 1941, when Japan attacks Britain and the United States, and then Germany declares war on the United States. We have the major players now are all in the war. On the Allied side, you got the British Empire, you got the Soviet Union, you got the United States. On the Axis side, you got Germany, Italy, and Japan. And then, of course, also you've got these two major conflicts that are kind of underway. You've got the European War and you've got the Pacific War. what happens at the time is the Allied authorities, now I'm primarily referring to the British and Americans, realize that out of these two major contests that are going on and these different Axis adversaries, that Germany is the greatest threat and that the war in Europe is the priority. And so they established what they call the Germany First principle or rule, in which the Western allies are going to devote the bulk of their efforts in defeating Germany first, and they'll only use those forces necessary to contain the Japanese. And then once Germany is defeated, then they'll go ahead and defeat Japan. At least that's the way it's supposed to work. And in effect, I think when you look at what it takes to defeat Germany, that proves to be a correct strategy because it takes the combined power of all three of the main Allied forces to defeat Germany. I mean, the Soviet Union puts 100% of its war effort against Germany until Germany is defeated. The British Empire, somewhere in the realm of 80 to 90% of its overall effort goes towards Germany. And the United States, even though the bulk of the American naval effort is oriented towards the Japanese, overall, the bulk of the American Army effort is oriented towards Germany. And when you even it out, it's probably like 60% of the overall American effort, again, is devoted to this European effort. It takes all of that force to defeat the Germans. So from December 1941, once this thing is established, it takes 41 months to defeat Germany. The Japanese are only basically facing a fraction of this military power, only last another 3 months after that. So even though that the Allies throw the bulk of their effort against the Germans, they still have enough left over to take care of the Japanese. And that goes to show that Germany was indeed the greatest threat, and the wisdom of the Germany First policy. Now, what degree does that hinder operations in the Pacific? Well, obviously it hinders it somewhat, but at the same time, too, it doesn't hinder that much because, again, Japan only holds out another 3 months after Germany is defeated.
You paint a picture of that once wars declared, they don't really have a chance of winning unless we capitulated through panic.
Right. That's exactly true.
Which I think was their plan.
That was their plan. I mean, the Japanese understood, at least informed Japanese leaders understood that when they went to war, they were gambling. They were gambling on the notion that Britain is too preoccupied in Europe to basically put up much of a defense in the Far East, which, of course, was initially true, and that the United States, despite all of its material abundance, is morally weak. And accordingly, their plan was, if we score a number of immediate, decisive victories against the Americans, they will come to a negotiated settlement that will allow us to conquer and maintain this empire that we desire. That was their hope. The understanding is if it doesn't work out this way, they're really putting their fate in hoping that their adversaries will do what they want them to do. And if America has different ideas and says, no, we're going to fight, then Japan is in an extremely precarious situation to the extent that really they have no chance of winning because America will simply, and Britain to a lesser extent, will simply be able eventually to overwhelm them. And even their idea of pursuing, decisive naval battles where they're going to score these things. If the Japanese had wiped out the entire American Pacific fleet, the Americans simply would have rebuilt a new fleet, which they essentially did, and eventually overwhelmed the Japanese. Just to give you an idea of the scale of the material abundance and power that the Allies were able to produce during the war. And I realize I got some numbers here, but just a few things that just demonstrate this. During the course of World War II, in terms of tank and self-propelled guns, the British produced 33,000, the United States produced 88,000, Japan produced 2,500. Artillery pieces, the British produced 140,000, the United States 257,000, Japan 13,000. Aircraft, the British 151,000, United States 324,000, Japan 76,000. And then principal warships or major warships. What I define here would be battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. During the war, the British will produce 458, the United States 749. Again, they're essentially building a new fleet. The Japanese 257. Now, in fairness, most of these resources, again, are going to be utilized against the war in Germany. Enough is left over to overwhelm the Japanese. And again, an example of that overwhelming impact is just, you look at the comparisons of aircraft available to the two sides. At the end of 1942, beginning of 1943, the Americans have just under 36 2,200 aircraft in the Pacific against a Japanese force of 3,200 aircraft. So there's basic general parity there. The Americans have a slight edge, but general parity. By the time you get to July 1945, the Americans have 22,000 aircraft engaged in war against Japan against 4,100 for the Japanese. So the Japanese are outnumbered by a factor of more than 5-1. And when you throw British and Commonwealth aircraft in the mix, it's 6 or 7-1. And this is just one category. Japan had no ability to materially compete with the West, assuming the West will continue to fight. And when the West chose to continue to fight, Japan had no prospect for victory, and their defeat was inevitable.
Well, that seems like a good place to finish. Thanks, Brian. It is always a pleasure to chat with you. Loyal listener, Brian's book is Forgotten War, the British Empire and Commonwealth's Epic Struggle Against Imperial Japan 1941-45. It is well worth picking up a copy to give you a big strategic view of the war against Japan. Now, if you have enjoyed the show, don't forget you can sign up to be a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. And it is a big thank you to those of you who are already patrons. I really could not do this without you. Next time, we should be looking at the only Victoria Cross winner on D-Day. Until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.